Hey, welcome back to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm your host, Jim Dudley. And hey, check us out on the YouTube channel as well under Policing Matters. All right, so every cop struggles with traffic enforcement. Maybe you love doing traffic enforcement, maybe not so much. But what does the future of traffic enforcement look like? Can we transition from human intervention to automated enforcement? John Leibovitz is the founder and CEO of Passage Safety, based in Washington, D.C. Passage Safety helps cities examine, enforce, and evolve traffic behavior for safer, better, and more equitable streets. Mr. Leibovitz wrote a white paper titled From Speed Traps to Safety Zones, Innovating a More Effective and Equitable Automatic Traffic Enforcement System with Network Sensors and Behavioral Science. Well, that's a title. Welcome to Policing Matters, John Leibovitz.
Thanks, Jim. It's nice to be here.
So you look like a researcher. What got you into traffic research? Was there a critical incident, or what directed you to traffic safety?
Well, I'm not a researcher in the sense that I'm not like a PhD traffic expert. I'm a dad. I've got two kids, raising two kids here in the District of Columbia. And I would say that what motivated me to start this was really them. I started to notice a real uptick in very extremely aggressive and bad traffic behaviors, especially coming out of the pandemic, which I think a lot of people have noticed all over the place. I have a background in technology and in business and in regulation, and this area sort of covers all three of those things. I sat down with some friends and, who are more technically minded, and we started thinking, how could we address this issue? And we started thinking about traffic enforcement and specifically automated enforcement, and kind of came up with a thesis about how we maybe saw that the traffic enforcement could evolve to a new generation, which you alluded to in that word salad of a title that I wrote on the paper. This is a problem that's been brewing for a while. So I think between 1990 and around 2009, 2010, there was a 50% drop in fatalities of pedestrians from cars, being hit by cars. Starting around 2009, 2010, that trend completely reversed. And if you look at the graph, it's like very striking. It's a V-shaped graph. The numbers went up, and now we're actually higher than we were at the low point in 2009, by considerably higher. And so there was a real reversal of traffic safety for people walking, biking, and also people driving. I think everyone has a theory of what caused that. My theory is it coincides with the advent of the smartphone, and not just people distracted driving, but also all the other things that came with that. So Ubers and Lyfts and Amazon deliveries and smart mobility scooters. There's just so much more going on the streets now, that really changed the picture for safety. And then the pandemic happened, and just, all bets were off. People really started driving and behaving in very, very extreme ways. And so we thought about how could we solve that problem, or at least help to solve it. And that's what led to the formation of Passage.
Okay. So talk a little bit about the transition from speed traps to safety zones and how that shift could alleviate law enforcement officers from doing traffic enforcement.
Sure. So automated traffic enforcement, speed cameras, radar cameras, whatever you want to call them, it's not a new technology. It's been around in some form since the late 60s, early 70s, originally with film-based cameras that people would have to go and physically swap out the film. And then in the 90s became digital, with digital cameras. So that's not new. And what's interesting about automated enforcement is there are a lot of things that are interesting about it, but one of them is that it works. So studies have shown that when there is a camera at a particular place, there is a real effect that people do slow down and behave better, because they learn that the camera is there, especially repeat drivers, commuters, people who use the roads a lot. They slow down in those places, and then of course they speed up again once they're no longer in the line of sight of the camera. So that's one interesting thing about cameras. And another thing is the fact that they're machines and not humans, which I think has a lot of implications for equity and policing in general. But that effect is great. The challenge is that in most places, in most jurisdictions, due to a lot of reasons, including traditionally the high cost of the systems, but also the politics around them, you have a very limited number of sensors. So what ends up happening is you have certain hotspots where they may decide, okay, this is a really dangerous place, and they put a camera, people slow down in that place, then they speed up again. Behavior changes very locally, but not globally in the city. And that is sort of the core issue that we're trying to address with Passage. So one of our insights is that technology has come a long way since the 90s with the first digital cameras. You can build a speed camera with off-the-shelf component parts at a fraction of the cost of the traditional cameras. And in fact, you can even go on the internet and there are videos showing you how to build one yourself out of a Raspberry Pi. So the cameras themselves it's commoditized technology and can be a lot more widely deployed for a lot lower cost. So our thought is, instead of having one expensive camera at one place where people slow down and then speed up again, why not expand that coverage to be a zone? So it could be a corridor, it could be a neighborhood, it could be a set of blocks, it could be all around a school. You could have a camera on every block face around a school. And that sort of changes the way you might think about enforcement. And so maybe instead of having one big fine that you get for blowing through a single camera, maybe you get a number of smaller fines. So if there's 5 cameras instead of 1 camera, maybe you get 1/5 the fine. So it adds up to be around the same amount of money. But what ends up happening is people are getting more constant enforcement and potentially also notifications in real time or near real time through their phone, done in a non-distracting way, that alert them that they're speeding. And so maybe causes them to slow down. So this is sort of changing the paradigm of how automated enforcement works. The old one was infrequent enforcement and very high fines. And this model is lower fines with much more frequent and widespread enforcement.
Yeah, so there's some unpacking to do in what you just said. And one of the ideas that I was having about that zone where you have the cameras, there's that natural tendency to slow down because the cameras are there, but then try to speed up, maybe make up time, or just move, like if we're doing a crime map of traffic issues, collisions, that we just end up moving that space where a lot of collisions happen further down the road when people start speeding up after the camera. So I see that as an issue. And then automation, if we have an alert on our phone, and my wife sets her speed in her car at a number that I won't reveal. And when she hits that number, an alarm goes off in the car, a sensor alarm. But after a while, don't we get alarm fatigue, and we just, like anything else, we turn it off or ignore it? I remember, I'm old enough to remember when car alarms were first released to the general public, and every time a car alarm went off, we ran out and looked out a window to see if it was our car. Now nobody cares anymore. What about alarm fatigue?
Yeah, no, that is definitely a real thing. There's a lot to consider with this model, including the distraction factor of having alarms or alerts. I think doing something that's audible as opposed to visual is probably better in that regard. The difference between what we're proposing and maybe your wife's behavior is that there still would be a sanction associated with the alarm, right? So if your wife would charge herself a fine, like she had to put $10 in the family jar every time she went
like
over,
a swear jar,
like a traffic jar, or or if the city were to, actually enforce that, I think you would see that her behavior would change. And that's basically at a very simple level, the concept that we're proposing. Um, there's just at this point decades of research in economics, and so this is bringing in the behavioral science piece of it, that shows that the frequency and um, uh, uh, rapidity uh, um, of feedback and enforcement really do change behavior, and they're a factor in um, how people behave in all kinds of different fields. That you have this whole field of literature around behavioral economics, which has a whole thesis around nudging people to better behaviors, and that's still controversial in the economics literature. But I think most, if not all economists, whether they're behavioral economists or classical economists, would agree that having more constant reinforcement, is a way of changing behavior rather than sort of once in a blue moon you get a fine dropped on you. And by the way, the ticket comes in the mail 6 weeks later and you don't even remember, what caused it. There's no linkage, psychologically between the offense, which was driving too fast in a specific place, and the penalty, which is the citation that you get in the mail. So what we want to do is try to bring in some of that literature and those findings from behavioral science over the last 30 years, couple that with advances in technology to make sensors a lot cheaper, bring in insights from data science and looking at how can you analyze if you've got a lot more sensors, you're generating a lot more data, most of it, by the way, anonymous data, just speed data of anonymous drivers, and looking at then how do you design programs that have the most effect in terms of making the streets safer. You might even say, look, we all know that there's a whole, the elephant in the room with automated traffic enforcement is the revenue piece of it. The cities that have deployed ATE, the revenue generated is a significant amount, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars for some of the big cities, and factors into their budget planning every year. A lot of people criticize ATE as automated traffic enforcement as a regressive tax, because it's effectively charging people who, use the roads as defining them if they don't obey certain rules, and there's a whole discussion about whether that's equitable or not. But putting that aside, whether that is or is not equitable, you could imagine an approach where you say, well, the city has decided politically, it's a kind of a politician decision, what's equitable, what's the amount of money that we want to generate from the system overall every year. And then the question becomes, okay, if that's your budget, if you think about that as your enforcement budget for how much fines your citizens are able to bear, what's the best way to maximize the safety from that, right? Is it to have 300 cameras that are charging $200 fines, or is it to have 3,000 cameras that are charging $20 fines? So that's a trade-off. And I think that the behavioral economists, the data science, they can inform what's the optimal solution to that problem. And we've been working with a number of top tier academics from places like University of Maryland and Stanford. And we think we can bring a lot of that expertise into this problem to really think of it in an analytically driven, data-driven way to get at the core problem, which is how do you maximize safety from these systems, given a lot of the constraints that you have around politics, budget, revenue, equity, all the other things that are wrapped up in it.
Yeah. And we link your article, your white paper at the bottom of our show notes. I encourage our listeners to read it. You talk more in depth about the nudge. And we talk in research about that immediate feedback, whether it's positive or negative, and how that changes behavior. So I totally get it about the red light camera violations where you get it 6 weeks in the mail and, me and my wife look at each other like, okay, who did it?
Right. Exactly.
And then we find out that it's a friend of ours who borrowed our car. And
I'll that's your story and you're sticking to it.
Oh, no,
I
no. We have a photo of her behind the wheel with like
I'm just
total
kidding.
casual look on her face. So I want to talk about the proposed ATE system, the automatic traffic enforcement, in as far as you mentioned just now about equity and fairness. And this is one that constantly sticks in my craw because speed don't lie. If you're driving 70 in a 35, guilty, right? So where is the equity issue when we're talking about uh, unimpassioned, if that's a word, dispassionate technology, seeing the violation, all the accusations of race or gender bias or anything else, economic status, out the window, right?
Yeah, it's complicated, and I don't pretend to have the answer to that. As I think we mentioned in the white paper, and we're discussing earlier that the mayor of DC, Washington DC, Muriel Bowser, actually formed a mayor's special task force to look at this exact issue. So the city government approved deployment of a lot more cameras this year, and I think that raised concerns in the community about some of the things you're talking about. And part of the mayor's response to that was to launch this task force. And they've been working on a report which is due out shortly, I believe. I don't think it's out yet. So unpacking that a little bit, there's a lot of when you think about the equity issues, there's a lot going on with law enforcement, traffic stops, speed enforcement, et cetera. The first and most obvious thing is that in some ways, automated enforcement, a lot of people think of it as a less biased mechanism for enforcement than human enforcement because it's a machine. And like you said, a machine, just observes a certain input and gives you an output, right? So, in a lot of jurisdictions, they have cut back on, and I'm sure you probably know more about this than I do, but they've cut back on human police enforcement of traffic laws and traffic stops due to equity concerns. And in a lot of places, they're looking to fill the gap because they've seen upticks in traffic safety problems. It's a real epidemic. I mean, it's like one of the leading causes of death of people under 50 in the U.S. And there's just 10,000 pedestrians a year killed. I think it's like 50,000 drivers are killed. It's a real problem. So part of there's at the first level, just taking something that's human enforcement and making it automated has some potential equity benefits. Then you get into the question of, well, where are these cameras deployed? I think geography really matters. Most cities, the neighborhoods are stratified in terms of income distribution and other demographic factors. And so if you were to put all the cameras in one part of the city and not in another part, you're going to be affecting certain populations more than others, right? One thing I would say is that cuts both ways because you have, I think in some communities, kind of a two-sided view of this. On the one hand, people don't want their community members getting ticketed, especially when you stick a camera on maybe an arterial road that runs to a suburb, and so it's designed to catch people from outside the community, but because of where it's located, it disproportionately impacts people who live in that neighborhood, and they get a lot of tickets. So that's one concern. But on the other hand, a lot of these communities are suffering from an outsized traffic safety problem. They're seeing a lot more pedestrians and kids hit by cars, and they want it to stop. So the equity piece in that regard, the costs and benefits weigh on both sides there. One thing that we say in the white paper, which I think is important to kind of understand, is that the way cameras are deployed today, it's sort of this scarcity mindset where you have a very small pool of cameras that have to get deployed everywhere in a city. So for example, in Washington, D.C., there are presently about 130 speed cameras. My understanding is they're about doubling that. So let's say they get to 300 speed cameras with the new legislation that passed this year. There are 15,000 city blocks in Washington, D.C. So what that means is with the 130, 150 cameras, you're you're enforcing on about 1% of city streets. Even if you double or triple that, you get to 2 to 3%. It forces you as a policymaker, if you're the person in our case, it's the District Department of Transportation that does the ATE. It's not the police department. They have to make some hard choices about where do you position the cameras? Where do they go? What neighborhoods do they go in? And that creates maybe winners and losers on both sides of the ledger, people who get more fines, but also people who get more safety. If you have much more widespread camera coverage, it evens that out in a lot of ways. And I think that just having more enforcement in some ways it can help with the risk side of the equation. And then lowering the fines and giving people notifications and opportunities to modulate their behavior, reminders, so that they in real time know that they're getting fined, and maybe they get a warning before they get fined. Maybe you say we caught you speeding on the last block. Here's your second warning. Slow down, or you're going to get a warning. Maybe the warning escalates. Maybe the fining escalates. Maybe it's not fines. Maybe it's points, which is something that's a real live discussion here in DC. Those are all policy questions, but the fundamental point is that if you have more technology, more data, more insights, more behavioral science expertise, you have many, many more tools to try to address those trade-offs than you do with sort of the traditional system of, infrequent enforcement with very high fines.
Sure. I mean, I think one solution could just be, and every city can do this, is to look at their maps of where the collisions occur and position the cameras there. And I'm sure you'll get feedback that they probably are in impacted neighborhoods. And quick example, in California, we had a state senator from Northern California who said that police have used jaywalking as a means of harassing Black and brown people in the community. So his solution was to create Freedom to Walk bill. Freedom to Walk said you can now jaywalk in California legally, and as long as it's safe to do so. And I guess the measure of safety is if you get to the other side of the street and not
we'll find out
up,
if you weren't hit, if you didn't get hit,
then it wasn't safe.
Wasn't safe.
But what I guess in the research now, and I ran to the computer when I saw this, what I thought was a ridiculous bill that passed. Which of the 50 states has the highest injury and fatalities in pedestrians? California.
Yeah.
Of those, who are the highest? Black and brown people. So I don't know if the homework was done on that, and we end up shooting ourselves in the foot trying to fix something that maybe isn't as critical as you might think, and replace it with something that's even worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think the harm, I think it, just like in many different areas of policing, I think, the reality of community perceptions and needs is very nuanced and complex. And I think you're right. I think that a lot of these places where we have the most accidents or crashes, we're supposed to call them now, and I think that's the right shift, is not, are places where there are people who are Black and brown, they're communities, they tend to be lower income. A lot of these, traditional these arterial roads that are, 6 lanes wide, 3 lanes in each direction with no crosswalks for miles, or even worse, they have a crosswalk in the middle and no signal or stop sign, and they have the walking person sign. Those are really, really dangerous, and those are circumstances where automated enforcement really can be helpful. And all that we're saying is, do it in a smart way. I'll give one example back to California. One thing that's really kind of important in this whole discussion is California just passed a law authorizing ATE for, I don't know if they had it before, but first time in a while anyway. And several big cities are now, starting to are authorized under that law to run their own ATE programs. So San Francisco, for example, is one of them. the law actually creates sort of a formula, which, back to the politics of this, says that, you can only have so many cameras per 100,000 residents. And so I think in San Francisco, it's like 30 cameras or something for all of, it's not, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's a lot, but it's
Yeah,
not
we have a population of 850,000.
yeah, it's just that they aren't budgeted under the law. They're not authorized to deploy very many cameras. And you can understand why that happened in the legislative process. I think, there's a controversy over tickets. We don't want to, there's the automobile lobby. There's people who are, it's complicated, and they settle that in the way the politicians do, which is they say, well, we'll limit the number of cameras. My suggestion to California lawmakers or others thinking about this, looking forward in a future bill, would be, if you're worried about the revenue impact and the ticket impact, think of that as what your constraint is, right? So if you're saying San Francisco should only be able to generate X $100 million, $100 million a year of ticket revenue from these cameras, set that as your bogey, and then allow the cities and the jurisdictions to figure out how they want to use that revenue pool. Do they want to have one camera that's charging $100 million ticket? Do they want to have, that's obviously absurd, but that's just an extreme. Or do they want to have, thousands of cameras that charge $5 tickets?
Right.
Or maybe even points. Maybe they don't charge, so I think that that would give the jurisdiction a lot more flexibility to have more effective traffic safety campaigns, which is really what the goal of this whole thing is.
Sure. John, we mentioned the possibility of real-time feedback to drivers through the network system. How can law enforcement agencies utilize this immediate feedback mechanism to foster safer driving habits within their communities? We have automated mapping system like Waze and Google, and sometimes they tell us if there's an accident in real time. So can law enforcement officers be alerted that this is like a high time for people speeding or running stoplights?
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of our, look, we're a startup company in Washington, D.C. One of the interesting things about being in Washington, D.C. is that it's a little bit on the vanguard of this whole issue, and has some very innovative people in the city government thinking about it, and has some innovation programs actually in the city government to try out new things. So we were fortunate enough to be a participant in one of those programs earlier this year. We deployed several of our inexpensive sensors on different streets in the district. They were there from the coldest part of the winter to the hottest part of the summer. So part of this was just proving out the resiliency of the technology, but also proving to ourselves that we could do what we say we can do, which is build a very low cost sensor out of commodity off the shelf component parts. We did that. And what we found was that these sensors generated an enormous amount of data in real time. So we did a study. We did a write-up for the city with 3 of the sensors in sort of 3 different types of locations. And between those 3 sensors, over the course of a month, there was 350,000 rows of data, each row representing a data point in terms of a vehicle that was traversing the street at a certain speed, and some other data associated with that. Only the cars that were above a speed threshold, which in this case was 11 miles per hour over the speed limit, would actually have any vehicular identifying information associated with it. Would take a video and grab the plates and so forth, because those are the cars that would be ticketable under the current law, although we were not issuing citations as part of this project. The point is that the data that you get from that in real time can be sliced and diced in all kinds of different ways to give insights to law enforcement, to Department of Transportation planners, engineers, people designing roads, to help prioritize resources. So even without this whole aspect of the changing the way enforcement and citations happens that we've talked a lot about, just having the data at a granular level of, well, how fast are vehicles going, and what are the times of day and days of the week that that's happening, and which are my worst the problems where places where that's the worst. So for example, one of these locations was a school zone, and we had the system timed to correspond to the 15-mile-an-hour school day limitation. And we found there was, yes, that no one was obeying that 15-mile-an-hour limit. You know, it was like 70% non-compliance or 80% non-compliance in that area, in part because the speed limit was really low. So that forced you to ask questions: should we have the 50-mile-an-hour limit, or if we do, or is it purely symbolic, or do we want to take it seriously? And if we do we want to put speed bumps there? Do we want to do more enforcement there? Do we want to take some? Do we want to station a police vehicle there at certain times? Those are insights that are actionable for the city. And so having lots of data in real time is very, very valuable. And this is not low sampling data from a representative sample set of cars that are reporting back. This is every car that's going by.
Right.
So it's big data. So that's on the police side. Yeah.
Yeah. So empirical data means something as well. And oftentimes, we see this policy pushed out, and law enforcement doesn't have a seat at the table as a stakeholder. Is there going to be room is there a chair set up for law enforcement to come in and say, okay, that's a great idea. We're talking about things like traffic calming and putting out, bulb outs for crosswalks. And we're talking about the latest fad out here is the roundabouts. And the idea of putting roundabouts in like small residential neighborhoods just feels ridiculous. And I would
imagine. Have you ever
imagine.
spent time in the UK?
I'm sorry?
Have you ever spent time in the UK?
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure.
North of the UK, they're everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, in my, small suburban neighborhood where you could barely get two cars side by side, you've got, a roundabout in a T'd intersection. And I imagine that fire trucks are just going to go right over the stuff in the middle to get through. So we know the data's there, but sometimes you can have an experienced traffic officer sitting at the table that says, okay, that's a great idea, but I'll tell you why it won't work. Or maybe we should try this instead.
Yeah, my view is that so I used to work in the federal government. I worked at the FCC. I was also a deputy chief. And my postage stamp area was wireless spectrum. So that's a whole nother topic, which sometimes touches law enforcement issues. My experience in government was that the best solutions to really hard problems happen when you have a truly multidisciplinary, multi-agency approach where people are really collaborating and trying to problem solve together. So I think in many jurisdictions, that's the way things are done. In some, it's probably not the way it's done. I know that in DC, they have this mayor's task force. They've got people from all the different agencies working on it together. And I think that's a great thing. When it comes to specific individual, design decisions about intersections and streets, I'd like to think that, there would be some way of corralling all the insights and observations and ideas from different agencies. Recognizing that there are transportation planners and these DOTs that are like churning out intersections because there's a heavy workload. So I don't know exactly how that works and what the best practices are. I do know that the way our system works, we can collect this data and create a dashboard and present that dashboard to all kinds of different owners within the city government, across departments, and multiple departments could have views of the same data, and then hopefully that's a catalyst for them to talk about it and figure out what to do about problem areas.
Yeah. And so winding down, I want to be respectful of your time. The privacy concerns, are there issues? I mean, we're talking about vehicles on public streets. There's really no expectation of privacy. Does that enter into the conversation at all?
Yeah, I mean, it does, because I think you have to be responsible. I think you have to think about that in a responsible way. When I mentioned the 350,000 data points we collected, the vast majority of those data points were anonymous, right? That was anonymous radar speed readings where we did not, capture visual information. I do think that there's a balance, like in most public policy decisions, where if someone is violating the rules, and maybe not just violating the rules, but doing it above some threshold, whether it's 6 miles an hour above or 11 miles an hour is above, or going through a stop sign more than 2 miles per hour, whatever the threshold is, I think that public safety requires that you gather information about that. Otherwise, how can you possibly enforce and deter the type of behavior the laws are set up to stop? At the extreme, by the way, there's all kinds of issues with automated enforcement. One of the most basic ones that's emerging is temporary tags and fake plates. So you have a lot of drivers in a lot of cities that are buying fake tags, fake temporary tags, through the internet, and then they drive with impunity, right? So if you have fake information, which is the ultimate de-identifying technology, right? you have a false identity. So even if someone took a picture of your plates, it's not the right, they don't know who you are. That completely messes up the entire apparatus for traffic safety, whether you're enforcing through humans, through machines. You can't do any enforcement because you can't tie back, any criminal behavior to these cars. And by the way, that has ramifications not just for traffic safety, but also for other criminal activities, because I think I've seen anecdotally, and I'd be interested to see if there's data on this, there is a correlation between people who commit crimes and people who drive around with fake plates, in part because it helps them get away more easily from the crimes. So all that is to say that when you're on the public streets, yes, you are right. There's diminished expectation of privacy. I think as a technology provider, as a public policy, public servant, your obligation is to still try to be responsible with the data you do collect. But it can all be done in a way it's a very solvable, addressable problem, and it may have different contours in different places. But I think it's basically a solved problem in the extent that we have had ATE for 30, 40 years. And I think there's an equilibrium that's been established that's out there today.
Yeah, and 100% with you on criminality and the correlation with fake plates, no plates, or if you're even going to just be a scofflaw, and it is a crime to avoid the cameras, but there's a spray substance that people are putting on their license plates that's available over the internet. I don't want to give them a plug, but yeah, at some point I'd love to address those, because the flip side of that is we've had local legislatures limit the amount of car stops that law enforcement can make based on what they're calling the pretext indicators, that officers are looking for no plates or a cracked windshield or headlight or tail light out. And actually, they're being curtailed from making those kinds of stops. Lastly, can you share any pilot projects or real world implementations where you've outlined in your white paper and they're being used? Is that happening?
Yeah, so I mentioned the one we did in DC, which was a fairly involved effort working with the State Department of Transportation. We learned a ton. We hope they learned some things too, but we learned a ton about what it takes to work with the city government in a big city like DC, where you've got not just overlapping agencies, but even within a single agency, they're complex agencies with a lot of different equities in terms of some people are worried about safety, some people are worried about the infrastructure, and how do you work with them? And so that we were able to do that we think that was a successful pilot. We had a previous pilot in another local area. We've had some discussions with other areas, cities in the Washington, D.C., greater DC areas, including Maryland and Virginia. And I should say there is an enormous amount of federal money out there from the IIJA, the infrastructure law, that comes up once a year at different intervals for different programs that can support both experimentation and deployment of these types of technologies. So if if any of your listeners are out there and interested in exploring this, we're very interested in expanding, doing some pilots and deployment projects in other places. We can customize the technology to different needs, to have different requirements, different constraints, but also potentially with an eye towards once it's proved out, or even people are comfortable with it, there can be a leverage effect of getting access to some of these federal monies in order to really scale up and prove it out at a bigger scale. And so, we obviously track those things. We have some ideas on how it slots, and we have some university partners who are very interested in working with us and helping to do the analysis and manage the program to take the burden off the city. So anyone out there who's interested, please reach out to us. I think you'll link our information, but you can just send an email to info@passage.city. And it'll get to me. And we're looking for city partners to really push through to the next level.
Well, that's great. And if there's funding available, I'm sure you'll get lots of callers. Hey, and I said lastly, but at some point, I'd love to get somebody from Vision Zero on the program. I see them as more of an advocacy group. They're in many of our major cities, but I'd like to talk to somebody about whether or not they stand up to some of this poor legislation that, we could see at the beginning. Like, I believe the freedom to jaywalk, as I call it, I think that's bad legislation. And I would love to see somebody like Vision Zero, whose goal is to lower or reduce to zero pedestrian injuries and fatalities. And I think that's a lofty goal to reach that, God love them and help them. But are they for or against your program?
I think that Vision Zero. So I think that Vision Zero is great. It's sort of a worldwide campaign at this point. There are different cities all over the place working on it. There have been some real success stories, even in the U.S., like Hoboken, New Jersey is the most, I think, widely publicized one. But there have been a lot of places that have really struggled as well. The whole Vision Zero concept is they talk about a safe systems approach. So it's not one thing that solves the traffic safety problem. I think ultimately they want to redesign streets to be more pedestrian and cyclist friendly. I personally believe that automated enforcement can be a big part of that. I think that the traditional enforcement systems are really geared towards arterial roads, bigger roads, and less frequent. And our technology really lends itself to much more diverse and widespread applications, which can be compatible with Vision Zero. We can help city planners prioritize, with limited funds, where do you put the next dollar in terms of traffic calming infrastructure? Maybe there's certain places that are farther out on the timeline just because of the realities of budgeting and so forth. And in the interim, you have enforcement until you can physically change the environment. Maybe you do a combination where you have enforcement and physical changes. There's a lot we can do, and so we look forward to working with that movement. And I think it would be a really interesting interview if you could find the right person, either from the National Vision Zero organization or maybe from Hoboken or some similar place.
Great. Hey, thanks for being on the show, John Leibovitz, founder and CEO of Passage Safety, based in Washington, D.C. Check out the white paper. You'll see the link at the bottom of our show notes. Hey, appreciate you taking time with us today.
Thanks for having me, Jim. Appreciate it.
Hey, listeners, hope you have found today's show informative. Drop me a line. Let me know what you think. I'm at Policing Matters at policeone.com. That's Policing Matters at policeone.com. And hey, stay safe and be careful on the roads, and hope to chat with you again real soon. Take good care.